A price ceiling is a maximum legal price at which a good may be sold. Examples of price ceilings are rent controls and laws against price gouging. Supply and demand analysis predicts that a price ceiling that is less than the equilibrium price has 7 effects. The predictable effects are: the market price is less than the equilibrium price. Second, shortages tend to occur and persist. In a freely functioning market, the shortage would tend to cause price to increase. However, the price ceiling prevents price from rising, therefore the shortage persists. This means that the quantity traded tends to equal the quantity supplied. At the price ceiling, the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. When the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded, every buyer willing to buy cannot find a seller willing to sell. Since buyers cannot force sellers to sell more than they want to sell, the buyers will purchase only the amount that sellers want to sell. Therefore, the buyers purchase only the quantity supplied, even though this amount is less than the quantity demanded. The quantity traded tends to be less than the quantity demanded, than the quantity traded in a freely functioning market. In a freely functioning market, the quantity traded tends to equal the quantity supplied at the equilibrium price. When the ceiling is binding, the quantity traded tends to equal the quantity supplied at the price ceiling. The ceiling is binding when it's below the equilibrium. This means that the quantity supplied decreases as price decreases from the equilibrium price to the price ceiling. Fifth, alternative rationing devices emerge when the quantity traded Alternative rationing devices emerge to ration the quantity traded among buyers. Increases in price are not able to ration the quantity to buyers who are willing to pay the most for it. Since price is kept below the equilibrium price, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. This means every buyer willing to buy cannot find a seller willing to sell. When every buyer cannot find a seller willing to sell, sellers have greater discretion to pick buyers to whom to sell and to whom not to sell. Not selling to a buyer is not costly because a shortage exists. When the shortage exists, a seller can easily find other buyers sufficient to buy all the quantity the seller wants to sell. Here are some possible alternative rationing devices: waiting list and first come, first serve. Showing favoritism to friends, families, and people of influence. Avoiding selling to people with characteristics that the seller finds undesirable. The sixth effect: gray markets tend to emerge in which the price is above its legal price. Buyers are willing to pay more than the price when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. Sellers can earn more profit by selling illegally to buyers willing to pay the higher price than they can by selling legally to buyers at the price ceiling. Number 7, producers develop and use tactics that increase the real price without increasing the posted price. Here are a couple of ways to increase the real price without increasing the posted price. You reduce the quality of the good, or you require the buyer to purchase additional items from the seller. Examples of price ceilings are markets for apartments and for medical care. New York City has a myriad of laws that restrict the ability of landlords from raising rents. The restrictions generally fall into 2 categories: rent control and rent stabilization. Rent rates for the single-payer health system in Canada are set by the national governments that are at prices below the rates charged in the private market sector in the U.S. Similarly, the U.S. government sets rates at VA hospitals in the U.S. that are below the rates charged in the private sector. Let's talk about each of these in turn. First, rent controls. Rent control departments in New York City are governed by price controls imposed in World War II. Rents are very low and are set to cover the cost of building maintenance and improvements. One interesting caveat is that rent control departments convert to rent stabilized departments when they become vacant. Therefore, the vacancy rate of rent control departments is always 0%. Since rents are so low, tenants designate in their will who inherits the apartment to ensure an heir will enjoy the benefits of the low rents. The optional readings have great stories. They're up in the in the preparation section. Also, Doonesbury ran a series of cartoons about the difficulty of finding a rent-controlled apartment. Rent-stabilized apartments are governed by a series of laws passed by the New York City Council. Rents are low, and a government board determines the maximum amount by which landlords may increase rents each year. Rent stabilization often prevents rents from rising to the equilibrium price. Therefore, the quantity demanded is higher and the quantity supplied is lower than they would be at equilibrium. The result is a shortage of apartments. The shortage means that people have a harder time finding low rent stabilized apartments than high rent unregulated apartments. The data on vacancy rates confirms that finding a rent stabilized apartment is difficult. So here's the type of apartment. Again, rent control is always 0%. When stabilized, has a vacancy rate of 2.19. This is 2008. And unregulated was 4.67. Over twice the vacancy rate and unregulated as rent stabilized. People who live in rent-controlled apartments are often paying much less than the going rate. However, the deterioration and reduction in housing stock makes finding an apartment more difficult and hurts people unable to find an apartment because fewer exist. The allocation method used in place of rationing by who is willing to pay the most will determine who bears this cost. First come, first served hurts people with busy schedules. Rationing by connections hurts people who are not connected. Rationing by how the prospective tenant looks probably hurts people who do not look like the landlord. Let's talk a little bit about health care. Supply and demand predicts that the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied when the government sets rates for health care that are below the equilibrium price. One signal that the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied for a hospital is a long waiting time for patients who want to use the hospital. As predicted, waiting times in Canada and VA hospitals are long. Let's talk a little more about the winners and losers of rent control. The big winners are people who live in rent-controlled apartments and pay less than the going rate. However, their gain is diminished when landlords allow the housing stock to deteriorate. Letting the housing stock deteriorate with less service and fewer repair allows landlords to increase legally the quality-adjusted price. The rent control laws in New York City have provisions to punish landlords who let the stock deteriorate too much. Their gains are also diminished when landlords require tenants to pay additional fees or costs that are abnormal. For example, the landlord for a rent-controlled apartment may require security deposits and prepaid rent that are higher than what landlords require for apartments not subject to rent control. Landlords may require tenants to rent the apartment only if the landlord furnishes the apartment and charge more for the furniture than the tenant would pay if he or she rented furniture directly from a home furnishing store. Studies in New York City show that rent-controlled apartments require tenants to rent furniture more frequently than apartments that are not subject to rent control. The big losers are people who cannot find an apartment because of the reduction in the quantity supplied. Some localities try to stop the decrease in the quantity supplied by restricting the ability of landlords to convert apartments into condominiums. Exactly who wins and loses depends upon the allocation mechanism that replaces price as the rationing device. First come, first served hurts people with busy schedules and helps those with time on their hands or who can afford to employ people to stand in line. Rationing by connections hurts people who are not connected and helps those who are connected. Rationing by how a prospective tenant looks probably hurts people who do not look like the landlord and helps those who are members of groups for which the landlord has an affinity.